Okay, this is the audio lecture for Chapter 1, A Guide to Writing Sociology Papers. So starting at the absolute beginning, what is sociology and the sociological imagination? Simply put, sociology is the study of how and why people do things together. And the sociological imagination is a concept that comes from C. Wright Mills. That's about understanding the connections between the individual and the larger society, or as he terms it, someone's biography and their history, or the patterns and relationships on a larger scale. And applying this concept expands your perceptions. As the sociological imagination involves an individual developing a deep understanding of how their biography is a result of historical process, and again, occurs within a larger social context. When you use a sociological imagination, you have to place yourself outside of the everyday to view our culture from a more third-party perspective, which helps us be more self-aware instead of relying on social norms or other social factors that often influence our attitudes and behaviors. So, for example, Mills and other sociologists are arguing that many issues faced by individuals have roots in the organization of our society. For instance, if you're unemployed, people can say that's the result of your choices and actions, though we know that large economic downturns lead to widespread unemployment, or in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, people cannot control that factor of a deadly virus leading to their workplace closing. So if you look only at the individual being unemployed, you may miss the fact that certain people are more likely to be laid off in economic downturns, such as women of color, who lost many jobs during the COVID shutdowns. Or another example, tying it to deviance, or the social understanding of an action or behavior, whether that behavior violates our social norms, which of course differs between societies and within one society over time. So we have agency, but we're constrained by social history and context as to how we use that agency. So use gang membership as an example. If you join a gang, you may commit crimes or break formalized social norms, such as selling drugs or using violence. So as a culture, we judge and admonish, but we often fail to explore the history and context of an individual's gang participation. There's a film I show in my criminology course that explores this called Crips and Bloods Made in America, where former gang members talk about the lack of social groups and support for them when they were young and in adolescence, and this deep poverty that people experience due to the historical racist practices of redlining, segregation, and other practices which affected family organization and the likelihood of drug abuse in certain communities. So many of the youth who join gangs are looking for protection and a sort of family in a social environment with extreme conditions to navigate. So they're criminalized and incarcerated, but no one really asks why they felt the need to join the gang in the first place. What's the motivation? So the root of the problem is not addressed, and more generations are pulled into the lure, the protection, and the trauma of gang membership. So the sociological imagination is not supposed to excuse behavior itself. Obviously, we have agency and we make choices. But what kinds of options are open to us is connected to the social hierarchies, those past histories of colonialism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. And of course, they are current histories that are connected to that as well. So for instance, as a woman teaching this course, when I use my sociological imagination, I can see how 100 years ago I would not have been allowed to teach this course, as the social roles of women were different and women were barred from many career fields. So the ideology of the time and the social roles for women were different than they are now, which shows us how they're socially constructed. So my choice to teach or not is not just my decision alone, it's impacted by the history and the cultural values that surround that decision. So this sociological imagination is one of the most important concepts in sociology, especially when it comes to kind of framing research and understanding in a wider perspective, right? So it gets us thinking outside of the individual experience and look for larger patterns, but also balancing the fact that we cannot explain it all based on society alone, that each individual plays their part and makes decisions for their own lives. Okay, so the chapter also talks about sociology and other disciplines. So what distinguishes sociology from those other disciplines? Well, sociology typically, it's just the way we're looking at research that really differentiates it, right? So when you look at sociology versus psychology as an example, both of the disciplines are interested in attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and emotions, but psychology focuses on the individual, or often the human brain, for a lot of its research and analysis, versus sociology that looks at the micro to the macro, from the individual to the larger society. But when we look at individuals, we're still seeing them within a social context, as no one is raised in a vacuum. So it's those who socialize us that affect our development and our identities. So the book also has charts examining the difference between sociology and political science, history, philosophy, anthropology, and economics. Again, the differences in the disciplines are really the approach they take to understanding society. So for example, in my own research, I've examined political issues and American media culture, but it's the theories I apply and the approach I take that differentiates my political research from political science research. So sociology as a discipline is very interdisciplinary, often overlapping with the fields mentioned and others like ethnic studies, American studies, demographics, gender studies, gerontology, queer studies, and as well as others. So this is good for us because we like to explore all aspects of the social world, and lots of research that comes out of different disciplines can aid us in doing so. Also, when it comes to creating your own research, feel free to explore those topics that overlap with other disciplines, and we can discuss later how to tailor them to a sociological focus. Okay, so some varying perspectives in sociology. Within sociology, there's various perspectives, but we can, at this point, simply divide them between the micro and the macro, or the small scale and the large scale. When taking a micro-sociological approach, this means looking at questions and issues affecting people in individual interaction. So this means person-to-person contacts, or small group, or small-scale focus of observation. Looking at those patterns and trends at the community level or in the small group level, in the context of everyday lives and experiences of people. So for example, Randall Collins' book, Violence, a Microsociological Theory, talks about how violence is not easy to do. It takes overcoming tension and fear in order to fight. So most fights do not escalate into violence because finding people try to really size up each other to see if they can, fight the other person effectively. So this is that part where people go, what, hold me back, or you're lucky my friends are here, or any of that kind of bluster, right? So many conflicts never escalate past the bluster phase, where you try to see how likely you are to win that fight, right? The idea is if I go, what, and you flinch, it gives me more confidence to overcome the tension and fear. So again, he used a microsociological approach to find out this information, literally studying and analyzing thousands of individual interpersonal interactions to kind of come up with this theoretical approach. So he says that, again, human beings often have to overcome tension and fear to fight. That the myth in our culture is that the fight is equally matched, right? So whoever wins is the person who should rightfully win. But what he found in his research is that most people will not fight unless they're assured of victory. So in this way, some people become good at violence, but it's not really easy for most people to commit violence. So again, he looked at these fights between two people as the unit of analysis to focus on, and he looked at thousands of one-on-one micro-interactions, compiling those interactions and using theory to understand how and why people fight. So that's just one example. But again, it's the focus of the analysis that makes it microsociological. So taking a macrosociological approach, the macro approach looks at large-scale patterns and trends within the overall social structure, system, and population. So one example of a macro-sociological research question would be to explore the ways that race has shaped the character, structure, and development of U.S. society, which is what sociologist Joe Fegan does in his book titled Systemic Racism. Another common source for data that's used in macro-sociological research is the U.S. Census. So census data is used in various studies to understand the population of the U.S. in a multiplicity of ways. So for example, the census helps you find out basic information about the size of the population, its composition by age, gender, race, and ethnicity. So you might wonder, for instance, why the census asks about race and ethnicity. For sociologists that are doing research on racial inequality, the information that the census collects is vital. We can learn about residential segregation or assess how the racial or ethnic composition of an area has changed over time based on policy changes. So we can learn if there's relationships between race and homeownership from the census, things of that nature, as one example of how you could use census data, just one way. So different perspectives in sociology are just asking different questions And sometimes these can overlap into a mixed methodology. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well, about how you can combine the two. But when you're looking at something in a macro approach, remember you're just looking at it in a large scale way. So using another example kind of with that same census data idea, I remember this great presentation from a conference I went to where the researchers were looking at the difference between perceptions and the actual racial composition of neighborhoods. And they found that white residents overestimated how many people of color live in their neighborhood compared to racial minorities that had a pretty clear sense of the racial demographics of their neighborhood. So what they did was they did surveys to get people's, kind of perceptions, and then compared that to the census data on the neighborhood composition to find the results. So again, demographers use the census in many ways to explore many research questions. And it's not only the census, it's just that's one example of something that's really used a lot to kind of understand the shape and scope of the population, for example. Okay, moving on to methods. So again, the micro and macro approach also relate to different sociological research methods or different approaches to conducting research. So we'll talk about these much more in depth later, because we're going to go over how to write a methodology into your research paper. But for now, this is all you really need to know, that quantitative are the larger scale approach to answer larger scale questions about society. So this is, again, that macro approach. Quantitative data is collected in various ways, and then it's interpreted statistically in order to understand the relationship between social variables. Now, qualitative is looking at meetings in lived experiences. So qualitative data is not interpreted in numbers, but in diverse ways, such as direct observation, overt observation, or in cultural historical documents, lots of different ways, right? In order to understand and specify in detail how the social world is actually constructed. And like I mentioned briefly before, there is also the mixed method approach that combines these approaches in some way, often to offset the weaknesses of one method or the other. So again, we're going to discuss all of those much more in detail later. Okay, another important thing to talk about at the very beginning of this course is evidence versus opinion, right? So sociologists use evidence to dispel and highlight misconceptions about our society. So an opinion is what a person feels and believes that might be based on fact, but is of course subjective. So an opinion is a view that a person has. It could be, but it might not be based on facts. Right? So I'm sure you have opinions in your own life that are based on facts or knowledge that you've acquired over time, right? But at the same time, there's also people who believe the earth is flat, regardless of so much obvious evidence like pictures from space or how the stars and the moon change, time zones, any of that. They have a strong opinion, right? So it could be based on fact, but often still it's a subjective belief system. When it comes to social life, we have all sorts of experiential knowledge, but we're also socialized into values that we're often not aware of. Things that make their way into our judgments, such as, the kind of isms we talk about, right? Like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. So going back to our sociological imagination, the values of our time in history and particular culture really shape our opinions. So we have to be cognizant of that when we're conducting research so that we're not affecting the research with those preconceived notions or opinions. While evidence in social research is based on systematic sociological methods with checks for validity and reliability. And we'll talk about how you actually go about doing that, right? So at the very beginning now, when you're starting any paper, and especially a research paper, you have to start with a research question. The question will guide your research as it focuses your analysis or shapes the parameters of the paper. So part 1 of your research paper in this class is the outline and research question assignment. So the following information should help you get started to think about how to construct your own question that's going to guide your paper that you write throughout this class. So the first one, remember the sociological imagination, right? So first, remember the history part of the sociological imagination. So don't focus too solely on a psychological approach. Look at the larger social values or institutions or social hierarchies that shape what kind of lives we end up living, or the kinds of choices that we can make. But you also need to balance that with the biography part of the sociological imagination. So you want to avoid questions that overlook people as factors. We are data in a macro sense, but we're also people with agency, which is an important factor not to be discarded from an analysis. So then when you're asking a question, you want to look at often differences, right? Or relationships. So you're going to look at differences between individuals, between groups, between roles, between societies, or even time periods. So you do not want to make large universal claims about all societies. You want to be specific so you can actually complete the paper. If you ask a question like, why is there racism in sports? That's not going to yield a clear enough focus. If instead you asked how racism is experienced by student athletes in Ivy League colleges, you can focus it enough to find out interesting information, and that question narrows what research you look at for your lit review section, and ultimately what methodology you choose to propose for your paper to answer that research question. Also, you want to ask a question that requires more than a simple yes or no answer. So, is there crime? Yes, right? But ask instead how crime operates in a specific dynamic, right? Or things that are related to motivations to commit crime. Or, again, it's important to be specific. You want a question that's more complex than yes or no, as humans in society are much more complex. And these are often the kind of papers we're taught to write in high school and lower division college, where you argue a point like a debate or a persuasive essay, right? Where you're trying to convince the reader. See, that's not what you're doing in a research paper. In a research paper, you're asking a question. You're making a hypothesis after you review the literature, and then you test that hypothesis by using your research methods. So it's not so much about convincing us of your point, it's about testing whether or not a factor you think is happening, right? So you also want to ask a question that has more than one plausible answer. Similar to it being more complex than yes or no, you need to ask something that's interpretable, right? You may also want to ask a question that's drawing those relationships between two or more concepts, as the relationship is what you'll explore. So, for example, the relationship between studying for an exam and getting a high score on an exam. You can see how they're related, and you want to think about how they're related, like specifically, such as, is it a positive or negative correlation, which we'll discuss later, but in brief, a positive correlation is the example where as one unit increases, so does the other, right? So as more studying happens, so does higher grades, right? So we'll talk more about this later, but you need to think about the relationships and really even the directionality of relationships in how you come about constructing the research question that's going to guide your paper. You also need to make sure you have access to the information needed to answer your question. So you need to have cited information that makes the case that you're arguing. So basically, you just need evidence to support your claims. So this can be difficult if you're trying to study something that's super brand new, timely phenomenon, because the research takes a minute to be made, peer-reviewed, and published. So if you're looking at something too specific or too timely, it can make the process much more difficult. Also, if you're asking a question that can only be answered by data that you don't have access to, right, private data information, then it doesn't make sense to choose that question or scope because it's going to be very difficult to answer it, right? Also, when you're thinking about constructing your question, you want to make sure your question is answerable in the space provided, meaning you don't have to super overdo it for a paper that's not supposed to be like a 50-page journal article, right? The paper in this course, you're going to need 10 sources for your literature review, but we're not talking about like a 30-page paper here, right? Which requires much more sources and much more analysis, right? You just want to have a focus for your question that has a reasonable amount of variables so that you're able to, address each issue, right? So that you have enough pages to adequately address these things, but not so much that your research question is so unfocused that you need like 100 pages of lit review to be able to support it. So we're going to have, kind of through the weekly writing activities, opportunities to try to narrow your focus or expand your focus and really just try to practice how is it that you refine and create your own question. But again, it's important at this step to start thinking about what you want to study and how you can maybe articulate that into a question that can be, the guiding force of your paper. So as that's the first step of your overall research paper for this class, that's the first thing you should be preparing for at this point. I suggest when working through creating that question that you come back to this slide and really look over these ideas again or review this part of the chapter so that you can, kind of remind yourself and make sure that you're on the right path about how you're articulating your questions.